I'm going to talk about two projects today, and there are two projects, one of which we fully electrified, and the other of which we were not able to cross over the finish line for. Just so you know, these are not the actual buildings. I've anonymized by selecting comparable buildings. They're both in San Francisco. The first project is a electrification of one unit in a 2-unit condo building, 3-story building. And the second project was working on electrification in a TIC in 1 out of 6 units. When folks think about condos, they often imagine these 80s or 90s structures, but there are a lot of these types of buildings in San Francisco, and I think that there's some unique challenges and other Bay Area cities, older buildings. These are both built in around the 1910s. As I mentioned, we crossed the finish line on one, and the other actually has not had any gas loads replaced yet. And so I'm going to talk about the barriers that caused that second one not to succeed in particular, and challenges that we came across in both of these projects. So project one, where I think it was a generally successful project, it's a 3-bed, 2-bath, 2-floor condo on the 2nd and 3rd story of a 2-unit building over a garage. Very typical building for San Francisco. It had been redone recently, so it had very nice interior finishes and kind of unusual architecture and room distribution. This generally drives up the cost because it means that there are harder paths for wiring and for plumbing, and a high level of finish if you have to cut into the walls and do any patching. Luckily, in this second picture, you can see there's a dedicated back porch that was actually deeded to this condo unit, and this was very important for being able to find space for the machines. When we arrived, all of the appliances were gas. The owner and they wanted an EV charger. The owner was very motivated for climate reasons. They actually found my company, All Electric California, after the first contractor who they'd hired to replace the on-demand water heater you can see in the middle image here. They'd hired somebody, they bought the machines, they delivered the heat pumps, and then it turns out they weren't licensed and they weren't able to get permits. And so they just had these machines sitting on the back porch for about 6 months, which was one of the challenges to this project. But they also had us replacing, I've got my captions mixed up down here, but they had us replacing a gas range in addition to the water heating, space heating, dryer, and EV charger. And when they brought us in, they'd already found somebody who was putting in a heat pump for space heating, but that person didn't want to do the hookups for the electrical, so we did a little portion of that. And as part of it, they also had a full panel that you can see here, which we had to increase the size of, although we didn't increase the capacity. So the first step, we pulled it's very easy for us in San Francisco. We just pull electrical permits online. It takes about 5 minutes. In order to get a plumbing permit, we have to actually go to DBI and wait in line for an hour. And so we got these and we started the project. First up, replacing the panel, just putting in this slightly larger, physically larger panel that you can see here, and then cutting some routes through the building to run wires for the new loads that we're adding. And then second up, we installed that heat pump water heater that you can see in the middle image, Sanco 2, which is my absolute favorite ultra-low global warming potential water heater that another contractor had purchased and just left on that back porch, and then capped the gas at the range in the dryer where we provided new circuits. A couple weeks later, the HVAC contractor they'd hired installed the Mitsubishi that you can see, which we then hooked up. And it just, a few weeks after we'd started the project, the permits were all passed, and we were able to get tech heat pump water heater, HVAC, and panel rebates, some BayREN rebates, and then eventually the owner got California Energy Smart Homes because it was fully electrified. Although that isn't stackable with BayREN, so that amount was slightly lesser. And, thinking about the obstacles to this particular project, the wall-mounted heat pump water heater that we did had to be kind of high up because they had that great back deck, but they wanted to preserve some of the space. And that triggered some extra code protections as well as some noise transmission. We had to install the tank for the heat pump water heater, and I didn't put a picture of this in here, in a utility closet that was 9 feet up in the air. So that added some cost as well. One of the challenges was that for warranty on the machine, it was kind of unclear how it was going to work since we hadn't purchased the machine. There was no kind of chain of custody, if you will. It had been gathering dust. There were some lost parts that had disappeared. And generally, there was just challenging building geometry with a high level of finish. But all of these obstacles, while they increased the cost, and I'd rather that we hadn't had to encounter these obstacles. Nonetheless, they weren't deal breakers for the project, and so we were able to finish completely. By comparison, case number 2, despite putting in a huge amount of effort and paying us a fair amount of money, the owner encountered serious obstacles and so has not been able to electrify anything yet. It's a 2-bedroom, 1-bath in a 6-unit TIC. And again, the owner came to us motivated to reduce emissions, having purchased the apartment just a few months earlier. It's in the middle floor of 3 floors with no parking. This is generally challenging, the middle floor units, because in order to get pipes or wires to that unit, you have to go through somebody else's unit that the owner does not own, or you have to go through HOA space, which the owner does not unilaterally control. And what was more complicated, looking at this building, was that the electrical service was insufficient when using the standard calculation methods. Like like Laura was talking about earlier, we had to do a 220.87 load study because there was not sufficient juice distributed throughout all 6 units. Already it was at the limit. And so we had to spend some time initially, and there was some cost that we charged to the client in order to be able to justify adding these loads. And each of the apartments had an in-unit the electrical panel that only had 60 amps of capacity, and replacing the wires again would require going through somebody else's unit, getting permission, etc. So we did the load study. We determined that we were going to be able to add devices to the service, but not to the sub panel in the apartment because it was only 60 amps. So we came up with a plan to install a heat pump water heater to replace this gas water heater in a closet off the back door on the back stairs, which is where all of the heat pump or all of the gas water heaters for the different units were located. And so we proposed running conduit up the back of the building. You can see there's already some pipes and conduit from previous projects there. And we were going to put a new sub panel for this unit in the basement in their storage area that was going to supply these new loads. And this way we didn't have to worry about that undersized 60 amp panel in the apartment or modify it at all. And so this was approved by the HOA. We pulled an electrical permit. We started to do the work, but we very promptly ran into some discoveries of things that weren't to code and issues, and ultimately HOA politics that we just stumbled into without really having recognized that this was going to be an issue. And the owner did as well, since they were a new owner in the building. And ultimately, about a month after we had installed our new sub panel in their dedicated basement storage area, the HOA reversed their approval and required the owner to pay us to remove our work and our electrical connection to the future water heater location. And the rationale was that the basement area was not deeded dedicated storage. It was just unofficially attributed by the TIC, but still common space. And so even though the owner had a locking door to this particular area where we had put the panel, the idea was that maybe at some future time the HOA was going to use the space for something else, and so they didn't want a panel in there. And the HOA, even though nobody else was interested in electrifying at that particular moment, the HOA also ruled that it wasn't necessarily fair for one person to electrify before others, because it might impede other people electrifying further down the line. Those were the reasons that were given, but I ultimately came to understand. I'm sorry I don't have a picture of our panel that we installed in that basement area. We took it out and I didn't get any pictures first. But I came to understand that some of the HOA owners were simply hostile to work in the building and maybe hostile to electrification generally. And so I think that these reasons for stonewalling the project were sort of the reasons that they found, and not necessarily the most legitimate and thought out arguments. But anyway, the owner was undaunted and decided to talk the HOA into letting him upgrade his in-unit subpanel, because that way he'd at least have more breaker spaces. And so we started work on that, and we immediately discovered, you can see here, there are some bare wires just dangling down through the building framing. This is totally not allowed. And when we looked into it, the HOA had hired an electrician probably about 10 years ago to rewire a bunch of things with no permit. And this is so unallowed that we just couldn't continue our work, and we had to tell the HOA, please fix this right away. Great opportunity for them to get 100 amps to the units, because they had to replace these feeders. And we provided a quote for doing this for all of the units. But the HOA elected to hire another company to do it without permits. They replaced it in what appeared to be to code, but they did not increase the service capacity. So a huge amount of work went into remedying this code violation without any future-proofing for electrification, which I think was a real wasted opportunity. And then we came in after that feeder had been fixed, and we installed a Leviton panel with a smart hub, so that the owner can hopefully, for some future generation of breakers that have automatic disconnection and reconnection, maybe manage the loads on that 60 amp panel size. So ultimately for this one, the biggest obstacle was that multiple owners in the building were not interested in electrification, and maybe hostile to work generally. There was unpermitted and not to code work existing in this building. And I got to say, this is not unusual. Probably fewer than 1 in 100 buildings that we walk into have not had some unpermitted work done. So I think that it's a thing that policymakers need to understand is a reality. It was a middle unit, so we had no way to access it without bothering the neighbors who weren't interested in electrification. And there were no outdoor spaces that were deeded, and indeed no utility spaces in the basement that were deeded to the unit, and undersized electrical services. And so I think all of these obstacles would have been possible to overcome through a higher project cost, except for the fact that there was really no mechanism to compel other owners to allow electrification. And so I think that as the transition to the clean energy economy picks up, it would be terrific if we could think about this category of building that is in between single family and multifamily. It's really, they're individually deeded units if they're condos, if they're TICs. Owners who have autonomy over a portion of the space. The permitting process could be a lot easier, and I'd love to see some categories of clean energy transition permits be without a fee and exempt from inspections. I think that would be a terrific step to take for water heaters, for example. But ultimately, the biggest challenge for these two was the politics between neighbors, and there was no legal mechanism to compel the neighbors to allow for clean energy transition work in the second building. In the first project, the two neighbors got along well, they helped each other, and now it's a year later, and we've just started working on the second unit. But in the second project, hostility towards electrification and a dysfunctional HOA just shut it down. So there we have it.